Okay.
Perfect.
No, right? Okay. So next week, the Monday is a trial. And
There we go. Okay, so today we're here to hear Helen Steward give a talk called Knowing We're Free. I'll do a brief introduction to the group. Some of you are, I think, here for the first time. A lot of you are here for the multiple times. So welcome to the Agency and Responsibility Research Group. Everyone makes the pirate joke. That was part of the design when I was trying to figure out the best name and the best acronym. So, you know, these are just online talks that I've tried to put together since 2021. You know, that no one, I don't get anything out of these other than the pleasure of hearing the speakers talk. I don't reimburse the speakers. This is just something that's a sort of DIY model for building a community. I will say this, I don't always go through this part, but some people might not know the history. So every once in a while, it's worth going through it. So part of the motivation for doing this group was that John Martin Fisher and some of his grad students many moons ago, the early aughts, had Garden of Forking Paths, which was amazing. In my own estimation, it was the most interesting and important sort of specialized blog in the blogosphere in the early days. And then once John and the students decided that was a little bit more work than it was worth, I started Flickers of Freedom, which was a sort of, we just sort of moved venues to somewhere else. And I did that for many moons. And then that too got to be more work than it seemed worth. And then, and I think talking to people, we all missed it. And so I started this once the COVID happened, once the pandemic happened, and I thought, oh, this online thing is actually might make it possible to do something a little more interesting and engaging than a blog. So that's how we ended up here. And it's been great. So it's been great to see a lot of faces that I've seen before and people that I've never met that I would otherwise meet at conferences. So we have some upcoming events. So Pamela, who's here, which is great, is giving a talk on May 16th. Michael McKenna, who apologized for not being able to make it today, just told me he's going to give a talk. He had to cancel an earlier talk, so he's going to give a talk next year. I'll try to line up some more speakers from next year. You can see at the bottom that there's been a pretty, I've been ecstatic to have an honor to have such a great list of past speakers. You can find all of the past recordings for all these talks on the homepage. And you can also, I don't have it updated for today yet, but you can also find links to all the books for all of the authors. So please check all that stuff out. Okay, during the talk, I'm going to make it so you can't unmute yourself here in a couple seconds. And then I'll give you your power back after the talk. If you have any questions, just use the hand raise icon. All I ask is that when you're asking the questions after the talk, please leave your hand raised until everything is done. So until Helen is done answering your question, because otherwise you bounce around on the screen and it makes it confusing. So just leave your hand up until the next person, right? So leave your hand up. And then if we run out of time or you don't have time to ask the question you wanted, if you just add it to the chat, I will always pass those questions along to the speakers. Of course, you can email them yourselves after the fact. Okay, so today's speaker, we have Helen Steward. She's professor of philosophy of mind and action at the University of Leeds. Before moving to Leeds in 2007, she was fellow and tutor in philosophy at Balliol College, Oxford for 14 years. Her research interests lie mainly in the philosophy of action and free will, the philosophy of mind, and the metaphysical and ontological issues which bear on these issues, for example, causation, supervenience, levels of explanation, the event-state distinction, the concepts of process and power. She has also worked on the category of animality and on understandings of the human being, which takes seriously our membership of the animal kingdom and related biological and evolutionary perspectives on ourselves. She is the author of The Ontology of Mind from 1997 and A Metaphysics for Freedom from 2012. And she's currently writing a book on causation. So you can imagine, given all this, why I'm especially honored and excited to have Professor Steward speaking to us today. So please join me in welcoming her, and I will turn the reins over. Let me just unshare my screen so she can share her screen.
Thanks very much, Thomas, for that lovely introduction. It's lovely to be here. Thank you all so much for coming. If I lapse into inaudibility at any point, please do feel free to shout, raise your hand. I know that sometimes happens on Zoom. Sound drops in and out unaccountably. So do let me know if at any point you can't hear me properly. I should have asked Thomas how long I have. I have quite a flexible PowerPoint. I can do some parts, not other
yeah.
parts.
So, I
But
mean,
yeah,
usually these things go, 45 minutes or so,
that's what I guessed.
and
That's
then
what
another
I
45 for
think that,
Q&A, but that it's flexible. I mean,
I
we
think
can.
that's roughly what I have. So that's
Perfect.
good news.
Awesome.
That's
And then, by the way, I realized that for some reason I was doing security and you guys couldn't share your videos. So I have changed that. So I'm gonna make it so you can't unmute yourselves for now. But this is for the reason of preventing people from Zoom bombing us. But you can, if you want to share your videos, you can now do that. I apologize. Thanks for pointing that out.
okay. So hopefully you can now see the PowerPoint. I can see it. It looks as though it's in roughly the right place.
Yep, it's perfect.
Okay. Yeah, so this talk's called Knowing We're Free. And it's an attempt to address a question. I've actually tackled it a few times. And I keep tackling it because people keep asking me about it. It seems to be an issue that bothers people. And I've come to think that you need to defend it in more than one way if it's going to defend my answer in more than one way if it's really going to carry much plausibility. So what I'm going to try and do in this talk is explain what the question is that I keep getting asked, kind of set it up and explain why people think I'm vulnerable to a certain sort of objection about knowledge of our agency. And then I'm going to try and talk through the different, I'm calling them planks in this talk, the 3 planks of the defensive strategy that I think I need. It would be really good to hear what you think of those planks and whether you think they're going to do the job. But without further ado, I'll kick off. So the question I'm kind of starting with is this question whether I know I'm an agent. And I think to many people, it's seemed absolutely obvious that the answer to that should really be, well, yes. I mean, it does raise prior questions, questions about what knowledge is and what's demanded by knowledge, but also, of course, what it is to have this particular piece of knowledge. What is it to be an agent exactly? And of course, there are, competing accounts of that. Obviously, agencies connected with the capacity to act, to undertake action or activity. That's true, but unhelpful because it just raises the question what action is and how we're to think about action. There is a very undemanding conception of action available, which is argued for actually by John Hyman and Maria Alvarez in an old paper from 1998. They argue that really the best conception of agency is this extremely undemanding one where, in a way, almost anything with any causal powers is an agent, can be an agent. Anything which can make a change, make a difference to another thing can be an agent. For example, an acid can dissolve a salt or something, or react with an alkali, and thereby it's an agent. Or the wind can erode cliffs, or the waves can do the same thing. They can be regarded as agents too. But certainly in this area of philosophy, I think people tend to operate with a more demanding and discriminating conception of agency, which is connected to the concept of mind. We humans are normally taken to be paradigmatic agents in this more demanding sense. But many people would be happy to extend the category of agency to cover many more sorts of beings than merely humans. For example, I think most people would probably agree that at least some animals count as agents. And then there might be debates about what other categories there might be, for example, artificial agents or group agents or corporate agents and so on. And I think plainly, different philosophical concerns might demand that we focus on slightly different subsets of the overarching group. It's going to depend what our interests are. But I think a standard idea is that actions in this more demanding sense are kind of defined by their causes and perhaps in some cases their effects, but particularly their causes. They're the outputs of certain sorts of mental state. Things like beliefs and preferences, for example. That's actually not a claim I like. It's a claim I've argued against, that action should be defined in that way. But for the time being, I don't want to quibble with it. I'm going to just say, well, if that's that's the way you want to define actions in the more stringent sense, that's going to be fine by me for the purposes of this talk, because I'm really only setting out at this stage a very straightforward picture, what I take to be a very straightforward picture of how most people think about actions. And I think on this model of agency, where actions are to be defined as things which are the products of mental states like beliefs, preferences, intentions, and so on, it's pretty hard to doubt that we have the power of agency. I think if you were to doubt it, I'm not saying it's impossible to doubt it. Of course, there's nothing in philosophy it's impossible to doubt, really. But I think we can say that a fairly radical kind of skepticism would have to be involved in the doubt that we are agents. There are models for that kind of radical skepticism, I think. Eliminative materialism provides one. Stephen Stitch famously argued that there might very well be no such things as beliefs, because it might turn out that there's nothing that conforms in the brain to the causal profile that we associate with the concept of belief. So that might be one kind of way in which one could argue that, in fact, there's nothing to correspond with the category of agency, because there's nothing to correspond with the categories of belief, preference, and so on, by means of which it's defined. So that might be one route to skepticism. Or I suppose you can envisage that there might be a kind of general skepticism about knowledge of causal connection, that we can only really know that one thing follows another. We can know that our actions follow perhaps our intentions, but how do we know that they're connected together? You can imagine people raising questions like that. But I think these are quite radical and rather implausible positions myself, and you don't really find all that many people arguing for them these days. I think on the whole, many people would be inclined to insist that we do know that we are agents. I'm going to turn now to a particular person who I thought might be here, but sadly can't be here tonight, John Fisher. He's here writing about persons. I'm going to talk about his views quite a lot because partly because they were very influential in aiding me to form mine. In some ways, I suppose Fish has been a sort of foil for me. He's someone much of what Fisher says I agree with, and this will be clear as this talk goes on. I think he says some very powerful things, and then other things I dissent from. But he's always been someone I have read a lot of and thought about a lot. So this is Fisher talking not about agents, but about persons. He says, and this is from his early book, The Metaphysics of Free Will, our ordinary practices evince a commitment to the distinction between persons and non-persons. And this commitment seems to be invulnerable to certain sorts of discoveries about the nature of the world. That is, it seems incredible that we would give up the distinction if we discovered that a certain kind of scientific theory were true. Suppose, for example, that a consortium of well-respected scientists announce that they've developed a remarkable new theory, which implies that if one knows enough about the past states of the world and the laws of nature, one can confidently predict all the states of the world in the future. And then here's Fisher continuing, under these circumstances, I do not believe we would have any inclination to assimilate all entities with regard to the attitudes and activities constitutive of personhood. Our sense of ourselves as persons is relatively firm and impervious to most imaginable scientific discoveries. Okay, so there's Fisher making the claim that our sense of ourselves as persons is not going to be ruffled or shaken in response to the discoveries, any discoveries that that scientists are going to make. And actually, Fisher makes it clear that I think he thinks it's plausible as a psychological claim that we just couldn't bring ourselves to believe that we're not persons. But he intends it also as a normative claim. As he puts it, it just does not seem appropriate or plausible, very normative words, appropriate or plausible to think that we should abandon our view of ourselves in the face of, for example, the discovery, the scientific discovery that determinism is true. That just wouldn't be enough to shake our faith. So, what are the attitudes and activities constitutive of personhood, one might ask? Well, I think it's very natural to think that agency and the things that fall under agency would have to be involved. Could there be a person, one might ask, that wasn't at the same time an agent of some sort? I guess there might be arguments for saying no. I can think of two sorts of arguments, one related to the weaker thesis that we can imagine at least that bodily agency might conceivably be lacking to a person, and one more radical than that, that there might be conscious beings, conscious and thoughtful beings that nevertheless lacked agency. The first kind of example, counterexample, you might think might be provided by cases such as the one that is detailed in the book The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. I don't know, I expect a lot of you have read that. I don't know whether everybody will have done. It's the account of someone called Jean-Dominique Bauby, who suffered a terrible accident. I can't quite remember now what the accident was, but it left him able only to move one eyelid, and he had no powers over the whole of the rest of his body. He was, in fact, able to use the eyelid in the end to communicate, which is how the book was written. But of course, it's only a small step to imagine that he might not even have had the power to move his eyelid. Would it follow that he wasn't a person under those circumstances? I think most people feel that intuition would be deeply mistaken. Of course he would be a person. He just would be a person who couldn't communicate the things that were going on inside. But some of those things going on inside, we might imagine were themselves actions, mental actions, judging, deciding, attending, focusing, those sorts of things. It has, of course, been denied that mental agency is constitutive of I don't know whether to call it personhood. I don't think Strawson uses that term, but what I'm thinking of is Galen Strawson's famous argument that there could be beings with complex experiences of a conscious kind that might include various kinds of thoughts, which understood various sorts of things, but which didn't have any agency at all, including mental agency. His imaginary beings of this sort, he calls the weather watchers. I'm not sure whether Strawson's weather watchers really are conceivable or not. I don't need to take a view on it for the purposes of this particular talk, because I think even if one thought weather watchers were conceivable, it seems pretty clear that we're not weather watchers. And what I'm interested in is our agency. And it seems very plausible to me that what Fisher claims for personhood should also go for agency in our case, namely that it just doesn't seem appropriate or plausible, to use his words, to think that the idea that we are capable of action is one that could be truly up for abandonment on the basis of empirical discoveries. So, if Fisher's right, it seems to imply that no view forthcoming from what he somewhere calls men in white coats, or presumably women in white coats, would or should undermine our confidence in our own ordinary agential powers, at least in general. Obviously, you can be wrong about specific agential abilities. No one's going to argue with that. You know, I might think I'm a much better driver than I really am. Most people do. Or you might think you can ski when you haven't been for years, and actually if you set foot on the slopes you'd be absolutely hopeless. But the idea that I'm mistaken about being an agent at all is something that I think we can probably agree with Fisher, is something it would be inappropriate and implausible to believe. So I think Fisher's right about the non-negotiable status of personhood in the face of empirical discoveries, and I think that same kind of non-negotiable status attaches to agency. I think we probably can't give up anyhow belief in our own agency, but we shouldn't. Arguably, we ought to treat the idea that we know we're agents as a kind of fixed point that we're permitted to take for granted in our inquiries. That's something I'm going to come back to because it's going to be part of one of my planks. Related to that point, if some view or argument seems to conflict with the idea that we know there's an external world, then people have argued it's more likely that there's something wrong with that view or argument than that we do not know this. What I'm going to try to suggest later on is that the status of our knowledge of our own agency is very similar to the status of our knowledge of the external world. There are a lot of parallels to be drawn there. And even though, of course, it's very easy to mount arguments against our knowledge of the external world, supporting skepticism, and you can do the same for agency, most philosophers, in fact, take no notice at all in most of their inquiries of the possibility that perhaps they don't know there's an external world. It's just not taken seriously for a moment by the majority of philosophers in the majority of their inquiries. And there are reasons for that, which I will say a bit more about later on. Okay, so much for our knowledge of agency. So far, I've agreed with Fisher that we should accept that we know we have agency. But Fisher doesn't think the same thing at all about our knowledge of free will. Our knowledge of free will is treated by Fisher and by many other philosophers as just another matter entirely. I mean, most philosophers take it to be a live, it's one of the most live debates in philosophy, perhaps the debate about whether we have free will. It's totally separate in most people's minds from the sorts of arguments that I've just run through, which suggest that we know we have agency. It's just a different thing, is how people think of it, I think. Speaking of Fisher specifically, I think on his view, we don't know and perhaps can't ever know whether we have or have ever had the capacity to do otherwise than we did. The reason for that is that, and this is a quote from him, this sort of control implies that we have various genuinely open pathways branching into the future. The basic problem with this picture is that it may require us to have an implausible power over the past or the natural laws. Okay, so the worry there that Fisher is pointing to is, of course, the spectre of determinism. If determinism were true, there wouldn't be open pathways branching into the future. And so if we can't know whether determinism is true, surely we can't know whether we have free will. And that the distinction between agency and free will, and in particular, of course, for Fisher, between morally responsible agency and free will, between morally responsible agency and free will, is kind of fundamental to the whole way he sees and sets up the free will problem and his solution to it. I think, in fact, the epistemological point is behind, or at least partly behind, his important and influential distinction between guidance control and regulative control. Guidance control is the sort of control that we can know we have simply in virtue of knowing that we're agents. But regulative control, we could only know that we had if we also knew that we had free will. And we don't, according to Fisher, know that we have free will. And so we don't know we have regulative control. It also, of course, underpins the related doctrine of semi-compatibilism. That's to say, the view that we should be compatibilists about moral responsibility and determinism, but should either be incompatibilists or perhaps more broadly agnostic about free will and determinism. So I think it's kind of crucial to his whole picture. I think, indeed, one can see his picture as largely motivated by epistemology. It's partly because, perhaps mainly because, Fisher believes that morally responsible agency should be invulnerable to discoveries by the men in white coats, that he needs to separate free will, which we don't know we have, from morally responsible agency, which we do know we have, on his view. Okay. So I come now to me and a view for which I've argued, which I've called agency incompatibilism. Agency incompatibilism is the view that agency itself is incompatible with determinism. Okay, so I hope you can already see what the worry is going to be for me, epistemologically speaking. You could view agency incompatibilism as the combination of a couple of premises. First premise, the view that real agency essentially involves free will. It requires the power to do otherwise. Without the power to do otherwise, agency is as nothing. Together with the claim that compatibilist accounts of the power to do otherwise, such as, for example, conditional accounts or ability and opportunity-based accounts like Anthony Kenny's, or dispositional accounts, are just not good enough. They can't capture what's essential to our notion of agency. The relevant sort of power to do otherwise that we require if we're to be agents, I've tried to argue, actually demands that determinism be false. Now, I'm not going to rehearse those arguments in any detail at all here, because what I want to do is rather point out what people have thought to be the problem with my view, or one of the problems, because it starts to look as though the non-negotiable status of the claim that we're agents is under threat now from science, if agency incompatibilism is true. If agency actually demands that, I have real branching possibilities, real alternative possibilities, then it seems to demand that determinism is false. But then what are we to say about Fisher's thought experiment? To repeat, suppose that this consortium of well-respected scientists turns up announcing that they've developed a remarkable new theory. A new theory that implies that if we knew enough about the past states of the world and the laws of nature, we could confidently predict all the states of the world in the future. Suppose that happened. Suppose that, you know, through peer review and endless rounds of discussion and debate, determinism kept winning out. It became absolutely established science. What on earth is the agency incompatibilist going to say about that? It looks as though there's a worrying argument that shouldn't be available, that is available by the look of it, from agency incompatibilism to the inconceivability of Fisher's scenario. And you might just think that's crazy. You know, how can it be inconceivable that these scientists might turn up these results? You know, we could run that little argument that's there in the middle of this slide. If agency incompatibilism were true, we're agents. If we're agents, determinism's not true. That's what agency incompatibilism implies. So determinism's not true. The end. Surely we shouldn't be able to argue like this. Because of the conceivability of what henceforth I'm going to call the Stanford scenario. I've hesitated about calling it the Stanford scenario. I have in my head the memory that Fisher somewhere describes this consortium of scientists as consortium of scientists from Stanford, but I haven't been able to relocate the point in his work at which he says they're from Stanford. So I've called it rather tentatively the Stanford scenario. I don't actually know for sure that it was Stanford that was supposed to be involved. But anyhow, because it's a convenient term, I'm going to leave it in for now, the Stanford scenario. So at the risk of labouring a point, determinism is taken by many philosophers to be an empirical thesis, or at any rate, if not strictly empirical, at least broadly scientific. It's in the lap of scientists to decide whether it's true. Maybe the theoretical parts of science, the very theoretical parts of science, you might have to concede. Or perhaps more specifically, physicists. So it's, you know, it's up to physicists to settle whether determinism is the case or not. If that's so, you might think, well, we just shouldn't be able to reach the conclusion that determinism is not true by means of philosophical argument and kind of our everyday knowledge of our own agency alone. But agency incompatibilism can make it look as though one can argue precisely like that. So you might say it must be wrong. Okay. Yes, and here's Fisher. This is just a quote I wanted to get in because I want to talk about it later on. Our fundamental nature as free, morally responsible agents should not depend on whether the pertinent regularities identified by the physicists have associated with them objective probabilities of 100% causal determinism, or say 98% causal indeterminism. Okay. But you might say if agency incompatibilism was true, our nature as free agents would depend precisely on that sort of thing. And that might look to be problematic. Okay. So that's the case for the prosecution. And now I want to not quite give the defense, but rather sort of sketch the defense. What I want to do is say what I think is required for the defense. I have both in my original book, A Metaphysics for Freedom, and in subsequent papers, filled out some of the arguments I'm going to gesture at and sketch today. So, and some of you may know the further details of those arguments. But I've come to think that you probably do need all three planks to be convincing. Just relying on one or another of them is probably not going to be enough for most people. So what are the three planks? Well, I think one thing you need to do is kind of undermine what can look like the idea that there's an alternative safe harbour. Okay, I think what many people feel, having accepted, as indeed I do, the kind of Fisher-type point that our knowledge of our own agency ought to be invulnerable to that kind of scientific discovery, the Stanford scenario. It ought to be invulnerable to that kind of thing. Moving from that thought to the idea, well, then let's be compatibilists. We've got to be compatibilists. That's how to make it safe. That's how to make our knowledge of our own agency safe. I think the idea that we can make our own agency safe via that move needs undermining. That's plank one. Plank two is attempting to explain what kind of knowledge the knowledge that we're free-willed agents is. What sort of knowledge? What's it like? Is it empirical knowledge? Is it theoretical knowledge? Is it knowledge got by argument? What can it be compared to? What class is it in? I think one worrying thing about the claim that we know we're free-willed is, how can we know that we could have done otherwise? It's such a funny thing to know. The otherwise doesn't happen. So how can I know anything about what I could have done? And I think one needs to say something about that. And then thirdly, I think you have to argue that this knowledge is not in fact undermined by the conceivability, which I acknowledge actually, of the Stanford scenario. I think the Stanford scenario is conceivable. It could happen, perfectly conceivable. But it doesn't undermine our knowledge of our own agency, even if you're an agency incompatibilist, or so I'd want to argue. So I think those are the three planks, and I think you need them all to be convincing. And I won't have time tonight to go into each of the three parts, but I'm gonna just sketch out what I would want to say about each one. So plank one. So plank one, remember, is kind of undermining the idea that there's an acceptable safe harbour somewhere else in the arms of the compatibilist. I think the thing is, compatibilists do often present their position as the sort of safe and conservative option by means of which we can save. We can save free will no matter what, no matter what the scientists say, no matter what discoveries are made. And on their view, it's kind of the libertarian who makes this dangerous commitment to a genuinely open future, which is hostage to fortune, hostage to science, hostage to discovery. But I think the thing is, we shouldn't underestimate how thin a conception of agency is really available to the compatibilist. And once you really think about how thin it is, it starts to seem that what you've saved might not have been worth saving in the first place. I think for a start that if determinism's true, people might know that I've placed this concept of settling at the heart of my account of agency. Agents don't settle anything with their actions at the time of action because everything's already settled at the time of action. If determinism is true, it's been settled forever. And I think that's deeply, deeply at odds with our ordinary thought about our own powers. I think our ordinary thought is committed to the conception of our own agency as settling agency. I also think, and this is a harder thing to explain, but I think it becomes unclear why we think actions are sort of closely associated with agents at all. They just seem to end up being produced by states and events like everything else. And you get this view, which I think Nagel puts quite nicely in The View from Nowhere. If you imagine, you know, the deterministic scenario where my actions are produced by prior states and events, which are produced by prior states and events, and so on and so on and so on, actions seem no longer assignable to individual agents as sources, but become instead components of the flux of events in the world of which the agent is a part. I personally find that worry quite compelling. I know that it's been argued against many times by compatibilists that is compelling, but I have always found it a very powerful point. Another unrelated issue is about up to usness. Van Inwagen's expression of the basic intuition that I've been trying to get across about the inadequacy of compatibilism is, of course, the most famous and most discussed one, which uses this concept of up to usness. So here's one summary of his argument. If determinism is true, then our acts are the consequences of the laws of nature and events in the remote past. But it's not up to us what went on before we were born, and neither is it up to us what the laws of nature are. Therefore, the consequences of these things, including our present acts, are not up to us. But the idea that the things we bring about by means of our actions and our actions themselves should be up to us, again, seems to me to be a very important part of our conception of what they are. This is my slightly different way from a Metaphysics for Freedom of trying to bring out the intuition about up to usness. Of course, in that book, I am anxious to extend my concept of agency to many animals. So this is me from 2012. Where animals exist in a world, the unfolding of that world through time must wait upon decisions and choices which have to be made by those animals, not just temporally, but also metaphysically. By this, I mean nothing in the universe which exists prior to the period of time t, in which a given animal undertakes the sequence of activity that's constitutive of a given process of acting, can determine precisely what the animal is going to do, because precisely what will happen is up to the animal, which has not yet acted. Okay, so that's my slightly different way of filling out the thought about up to usness not being capturable properly by determinism. Of course, the compatibilist is likely to say, hold on, Steward. We can lay claim perfectly well to the concept of up to usness. We just think about it a little bit differently. We can deny that the concept of up to usness is tied to the idea of branching futures. To say that something's up to me is just to say, for example, it's the effect of a decision I made or something like that. A decision which may well have been determined in advance, but that doesn't matter. I think, and this is again coming back to the question whether we've really got, whether we've really got an agent at all in this scenario, rather than just a flux of events. It seems to me that a decision like that is a decision in name only, a decision that's just determined from the dawn of history. Indeed, I might go so far as to say that it's not clear that I am anything that even deserves a personal pronoun in a deterministic world, that the very intelligibility of the concept of I hangs on the idea that things really are up to me in a stronger sense than is available if determinism is true. As many people have said, under determinism, I seem to sort of dissolve into a mere place where stuff happens and events take their course. But of course, we don't think of ourselves as mere places. We think of ourselves as sources of what we do. So those are a few thoughts about what would have to go into the defence of plank 1. All of them, of course, would have to be much more fully filled in than I've been able to fill them in tonight. But I just wanted to, you know, give a sort of sketch of what I think you'd have to do to make the compatibilist safe harbour look a bit less safe than I think it does to many people. The second thing I think that you need to do is say something about the status of this knowledge that we're free-willed agents. And I think the best strategy here is to try to draw comparisons with our knowledge that the external world exists. Of course, there are very powerful looking arguments to show that we don't know that the external world exists. Of course, that's got to be conceded. For instance, this argument, if you don't know you're not being deceived by an evil deceiver, you don't know there's an external world. You can put in your favourite skeptical argument, brain in a vat, or whatever you like. You don't know you're not being deceived by an evil deceiver, so you don't know there's an external world. That's the skeptical argument. But as G.E. Moore pointed out, instead of arguing as the skeptic does by modus ponens, you can run the argument as modus tollens, using that same premise. If you don't know you're not being deceived by an evil deceiver, you don't know there's an external world. Okay, but you do know there's an external world because look, here is a hand and here is another. So there are at least two external objects, so there's an external world. So you do know, in fact, that you're not being deceived by an evil deceiver. So the question becomes, where do we start? What's the more reasonable starting point? Is the more reasonable starting point the skeptic's starting point? Or the starting point that we do in fact know that there is an external world and can argue from it? If you had Moorian inclinations, as in some respects I think I do, you might think you can run something similar with agency. You could say, I know there's agency, and I know by philosophical argument that agency is incompatible with determinism. So I know that determinism isn't true. Okay, so agency is your counterexample. It is the reason for thinking that determinism can't be true. We know it isn't because our agency doesn't conform to it. Again, the idea would be that your knowledge of the existence of agency can serve as a sort of fundamental starting point for debate because, like knowledge of the external world, according to Moore, it's more certain than any of the bases on which one might think to doubt it. So that's plank 2, and if people are interested, I've tried to talk a lot about plank 2 in it was my presidential address for the Aristotelian Society, which is called Free Will and External Reality, Two Skepticisms Compared, in which I make out the case for that comparison, at least some aspects of it in much more detail. Then plank 3. You have got to answer this fundamental question of how one could know the truth of a thesis like indeterminism by means of philosophical argument alone. And that needs one to confront certain ideas that I think people tend to have about what sort of thesis a thesis like determinism or indeterminism is. Earlier, of course, we saw Fisher representing the question whether determinism is true as equivalent to the question whether the pertinent regularities identified by the physicists have associated with them objective probabilities of 100%, that's causal determinism, or say 98%, that's causal indeterminism. Well, you know, I would agree if that were the question, then obviously no philosopher should be able to answer it a priori. It just really shouldn't be the sort of thing that you should be able to find out a priori. But in my view, that isn't the question. That isn't the question, whether determinism is true. I'm going to accept, for the sake of argument, Fisher's official definition of determinism. I think there are alternative and better definitions, but for the sake of argument, I'm going to accept this one. So this is from, I think, My Way. For my purposes, I take it that the essence of the doctrine is that the total set of facts about the past, together with the natural laws, entail all the facts about what happens in the present. Sorry, that should say present and future. Slightly more carefully, the doctrine of causal determinism entails that for any given time, a complete statement of the temporally genuine or non-relational facts about that time, together with a complete statement of the laws of nature, entails every truth about what happens after that time. So even taking that for granted, I want to ask this question. Would it follow from that definition of Fisher's that the question whether determinism is true is the same question as the question whether the pertinent regularities identified by the physicists are, associated with 100% probabilities or 98% probabilities? And my answer to that is no, it wouldn't follow, because we have to distinguish between the claim that the laws are deterministic and the claim that a world exemplifying those laws is deterministic. They are not the same thing. You can, for instance, imagine indeterministic worlds, all of whose laws are completely deterministic. An example that I've given elsewhere is a world in which there's just one law, right? It's chaos. Nobody's been able to find any regularities apart from this one. This one stands out. It's just a single law to the effect that everything that's red at a given moment turns blue 10 seconds later and then back again to red 10 seconds after that. That always holds. It's completely deterministic, no exceptions whatever. And everything else in the world, let's suppose, is sheer chaos, with no other laws, either deterministic or chance-fixing, holding sway. Well, that's a world in which the pertinent regularities are deterministic. There's only one of them. But the world isn't. The world isn't. Many just escape law. It's true that you have to have a certain conception of law. If that scenario is going to be conceivable, we can talk about that if people want to talk about it in the Q&A, what conception that might be. Okay, so I want to come back to the Stanford scenario. So I think the crucial point about the Stanford scenario is that we've got to distinguish very carefully between two claims. P1 and P2 on the slide. So P1 is the claim that the question whether determinism is true is a question that can only be answered by physics. It's a question for physics and not for anybody else. That's really strong. That's really strong. That implies that it's not for biologists or psychologists or anybody else. It's for physicists. P2, much, much weaker. The question whether determinism is true is a question that may one day be settled by physics, okay, and may well indeed be settled one day in the affirmative by physics. Now, I think if P1 were true, it would really be very worrying. But I don't think we've got any good reason for thinking P1 is true. And P2 is something that the agency incompatibilist can readily concede. I think, I'd have to say, if the Stanford scenario came to pass and, the evidence for determinism really was as irrefutable as Fisher wants to imagine, then yes, agency incompatibilists are going to have to hang their heads and give up and say, sorry, we were wrong. we made a mistake. Let's be compatibilists now. That idea is already present in Van Inwagen, actually. He said in 1983, it's conceivable that science will one day present us with compelling reasons for believing in determinism. Then and only then I think, should we become compatibilists. For in the case imagined, science has ex hypothesized shown that something I've argued for is false. And I think that's completely right. That's the right thing to say. Your bet as an agency incompatibilist is that you won't have to give up agency incompatibilism because of a Stanford-like scenario. It's conceivable, but it's extremely unlikely given what you believe about the world. This is my last slide. I'd like to say the Stanford scenario is indeed conceivable, but even for the agency incompatibilist, it doesn't stand in the way of knowledge of our own agency. It's perfectly acceptable and legitimate to argue that we already know indeterminism to be true, based on our knowledge of our own agency and our philosophical understanding of what that agency implies, in particular, the capacity to settle things. Okay, and that's the end. I hope I didn't overshoot my time too much. I think I probably overshot it a bit.
Oh, no, perfect. That was amazing. Thank you very much.
Maybe can I unshare?
Yeah, that's right. So if you unshare, we'll be good to go.
Where's the unshare? Hang on, sorry. Stop share. Great.
Perfect. Thank you again. Okay. So I have a question, but I'm not going to ask the first question. I'll put my hand up just so it's up. So let's get thanks again. So let's see, we have some questions. So Justin, you're on board. Let's do it. Oh, sorry. I remember. I've got to make it possible for you to unmute yourselves. now that you can't say obscene things during her talk, you're allowed to speak. Sorry, Justin, go ahead.
Oh, that's okay, Thomas. Thanks for putting this on.
Always,
I thought you were trolling me for a second. Go ahead, Justin.
Yeah,
Helen, excellent talk. I've been a huge fan of your work for a long time now. I just have a suggestion with regards to Planck 2. And so the way that I see your overall project is I'm seeing it as a radical incompatibilism. And you're showing how free will is connected to lots of different ideas, right? Agency just happens to be one of them. And so if that's right, I see you as raising the stakes in an epistemological setting. So I guess my suggestion is, why not go into the epistemic justification literature, right? And so Daniel Speake has done this a little bit with a paper a few years back, where he argues that pragmatic encroachment might be the way to go to argue against the skeptic. And I just think this would bolster your view. And rather than appeal to G.E. Moore, or maybe not a rather than, but an additional component that you could add to Planck 2 is appeal to the actual epistemic justification literature, showing that, hey, look, my agency incompatibilism actually raises the stakes even further in this free will debate, showing that the evidence that the skeptic would need to make the claim that we don't have free will just kind of out of touch or out of reach at this moment. What do you think about that possibility?
I think that's a really interesting suggestion. I don't think I know Daniel's paper or papers that you're talking about. I guess I don't know the epistemic justification literature that well, actually. You know, I haven't really looked at it in detail for years, apart from, you know, the occasional thing that somebody points me to specifically.
Right.
So can you tell me a bit about pragmatic encroachment?
Yeah. And so Jason Stanley, Jeremy Fantle, and Mark McGrath kind of put the view out there. It's the idea that you're not justified, well, in a particular context, you're only justified in believing something. It depends on the stakes at play in the case in a given context. So if it's a low stakes case, the evidence you need is not that high. But in a high stakes case, you need more evidence to make your claim. And so what I see your project doing, and it's a very similar project that I've been working on for a long time now, is that the free will question really matters, and it's really important. It's important to lots of different things. And so the more that we can show the connection between free will and different concepts, the higher the stakes become in the free will literature.
I
And
see.
so this agency and compatibilism is awesome because it's a huge claim being made. We're not even agents, right?
Yeah.
And so if that's true, then the amount of evidence that'll be needed for the skeptic, just showing that it's possible that we have free will in a libertarian sense, is enough, I think, for them to say that they can't believe that skepticism is true.
I
So
see.
it's all about the stakes. And I see your project as raising those stakes by showing how free will is connected to something fundamental like agency.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, I guess the only I can see I've been worrying about the epistemological side of things for ages, but my sense of where to go has always been it's the Morean type strategy that is the promising one. But maybe, yeah, it sounds like there might be others that I haven't explored that might be equally useful or even more useful. Because
I'll send them along. Yeah, I'll email you the
that would be terrific. Thanks, Justin. Thank you very much.
Thank you again for the talk.
You're welcome.
So Manuel just added one of the papers by Daniel to the chat.
Yay, thank you.
One of the benefits of this kind of group. So good, thank you, Manuel, for that. Okay, so is that so Justin, does that wrap up the?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Andrew, you're up.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Yes.
So there's a question about Planck 2 and the analogy with the G.E. Moore type argument. And so I'm wondering if there's kind of a commitment that that the thesis of determinism is as far-fetched as the no external world theory. Or in other words, is there a kind of commitment that the possible world in which determinism is true is no closer than the possible world in which external world skepticism is true? Because it seems like, if the G.E. Moore argument is going to be undermined if you're in a context in which, say, there's lots of simulation machines around or something like that. So I'm wondering if the disagreement between Fisher and you kind of comes down to these modal judgments about how close deterministic worlds are in comparison to possible worlds in which external world skepticism is true, or possible worlds in which there is no external world.
I guess I did want to say that, yes, in fact, it's just as outlandish to believe that determinism is true. In fact, once you really understand what it means, it is just as crazy, because it is tantamount to, on my view, denying agency. It's just as crazy as denying the external world. Denying agency, I think, is as crazy as denying the external world. In fact, they're sort of two sides of the same coin, it seems to me, in some way. The basic question about what we are and the basic question about what we confront are connected together. And there's, so yes, in a sense, I do think it's as crazy. I think there are a lot of very interesting historical reasons why it doesn't appear that way. I mean, it's very much at odds, of course, with philosophical orthodoxy to say that, determinism, true or false, that's taken to still be a totally open question, really. Well, not totally open, maybe, but fairly open. Whereas, whether the external world exists is not really. And I suppose yes, I am urging that we see them as far more similar, far more similar than that. Whether I would really want to say they are, strictly speaking, absolutely of the same order of outlandishness. I mean, it might be that you could make some distinction there, but I would want to insist anyhow, it would be a distinction of a far smaller order than the one that's normally made. That would be the crucial thing. That's what I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just one quick thing. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, I think for Fisher and, you know, as a non-skeptical compatibilist, the determinism just seems a lot closer modally than the possible worlds in which there's no external world. And for me, that's kind of the source of why the Fisher-like argument, that's the appeal of, or part of what underlies the appeal of the Fisher type argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think it wouldn't seem so to me, because the deterministic world would really be a world I wasn't in.
Yeah.
And none of us would be in. There'd be these ersatz things that appeared to be in certain ways like us from the outside, if there were an observer to watch. But yeah, it would be as much of a simulacrum in a way for me as the brain in the vat simulation would be of the external world. I would think of them in similar ways.
Thank you.
Okay, Eddie, you're up.
Hey, thanks so much, Helen, and thanks again to Thomas. I'll try to be brief. I mean, some of what you said in response to Nathan is relevant to, to Andrew is what I wanted to ask you about. I mean, one way to put it is your way of describing determinism is scary enough to make me an incompatibilist, and I'm right. I mean,
okay, right.
So much seems to depend on how we're understanding the thesis of determinism.
Sure,
and
that's totally true.
And I guess, the way I assume Fisher understands it and the way I understand it, it really is meant to be something that is, could be in a nearby possible world, and could be discovered as an empirical scientific thesis, probably not just by physicists alone, but physicists in conjunction with all the other scientists to make sure our minds aren't non-physical and blah, blah, blah. But of course, the compatibilist project is to understand that, kind of bare bones description in a way that still allows us to be difference makers, allows us to be agents that make a causal impact in the world, certainly not to disappear. And of course, incompatibilists are going to disagree about it. But the point is, it does seem like so much depends on how we're understanding the thesis at odds, and not just how we're understanding agency and free will. And just real quickly, I think you answered the question I was going to ask about flip-flopping, but it sounds like you're agreeing with Van Inwagen that you would flip-flop and become a compatibilist if miraculously the scientists could discover this full-fledged deterministic view.
Sure. I mean,
okay.
I think I acknowledge that the scenario is conceivable. I think it's, of course,
in a faraway world.
Yeah, incredibly unlikely to happen. But if it did, then I would flip-flop. I'd definitely say I'd move to compatibilism straight away. While feeling that, what had been I suppose I'd feel that I had been mistaken about the nature. I think I'd have to say I'd been mistaken about the nature of the compatibilist universe or something.
Or maybe your own experience or even of agency.
Yeah.
The other thing I just wanted to mention, because there's a lot of hands, is I don't know if you've read Chalmers on matrices, metaphysics, or that sort of view, but I mean, it's an interesting thought to wonder, like, if we really were in a matrix for our entire life, or brains in a vat for our entire life, putting aside Putnam's worries, one answer to the more argument is, we do know we have hands. They're just made of something very different than we thought they were made of. And of course, we don't know what they're made of in the real universe. They're just made of ones and zeros instead of whatever quarks are. We don't know what quarks are. But I think I don't think anybody's really written this paper yet. I've tried to a few times, but I think there's a similar move you can make in the agency literature and just say, whatever determinism is, it may be compatible with our experience as an agent, but you can't deny our experience of agency, whatever that involves. So it may just be that it's made up of, the background way the universe works is a little different than we might have thought. Maybe it's made of ones and zeros, or maybe we're actually all being remote controlled by aliens, but our experience still has these features that cannot be denied. And so instead of saying we're all under an illusion, you would just say we're not under an illusion. It's just different than we thought. I'll shut up.
Yeah, I'd be the experience of agency. I'd be a bit wary, I think, of hanging too much on experience, if by that is meant something quite personal and narrow. Because it does seem to me that one might, as it were, think one was an agent though one wasn't, or something. That seems possible.
I just meant whatever you talk about in your experience with animals. So third personal too, animals and humans and everything, all of that.
Yeah, I guess I think of it not so much as based on experience, but on what? It's like framework beliefs or something, I don't know. Fundamental things that are just basic than anything that, but not necessarily based on experience in the empiricist sense of experience, if you see what I mean. It's not quite that. I don't quite think of it like that. Yeah. But thank you, Eddie. Yeah, there was a lot in there. And I do take your point about how the totally global nature of skepticism in a way undermines its power once it's totally global. And you sort of, you start having the charmers thoughts, well, so what? It's all really just as I thought, except things are made of other things. Yeah. And maybe there is a parallel move in the agency case that I'd need to think more about that. I'd need to think more about that.
Good. All right, Michael.
Thanks for the talk, Helen. I was wondering, I was also thinking about one of the points that Eddie talked about, this the Stanford scenario, or where we're convinced that determinism is true. And so you wanted to say that, sort of like Van Inwagen, who says that, look, if I were convinced of that, then I would, and I had to choose between my view that we're free and my view of incompatibilism, I give up the incompatibilism, right? And I keep that one. And your view seemed to be that you would do something similar, that in the Stanford scenario, if you were persuaded that determinism were true, even though you think it's false, that you would give up the incompatibilism and hold on to the view that we are agents. And so I'm just wondering if you could say something about that, because it seems like that kind of move, that makes sense only if you're more convinced that we are agents than you are that agency is incompatible with determinism. That is, to my ear, it sounds like that makes sense only if you're more convinced that we are agents even than you are in your view about what agency is. Like, namely that it involves settling, and that settling's incompatible with determinism. And that's just always struck me as a sort of interesting kind of position to be in. Like, so I was wondering if you could say something about.
Good point. Do you know, I was thinking something like that when
agents than you are about your view about what agency is.
Yeah. When I was answering that previous question, flip-flopping, that thought kind of was in the back of my head somewhere. Yeah, I think it's a really good point.
Like, why not go the other way, right? Instead, and say, I would give up my view about agency. I would say that although I was convinced that we're agents, I'm more sure that agency involves settling, and that that's incompatible with determinism. And so I would say that I was wrong in my view that we're agents. Like, so why go that way rather than the other? That's what I was.
I suppose because, well, yeah, I think it's really tricky for me, that question. I suppose it's because it feels as though it would be really problematic to have this concept of agency that was uninstantiated. anywhere. And so if the Stanford scientists really came up with something, I mean, you know, I should say I wouldn't believe them straight off. I'd wait. I'd need it to be absolutely solid science that everybody was accepting. But yeah, it's something to do with the thought that, well, whatever agency is, it better be something that corresponds in some way to human experience and activity, and what we find ourselves in touch with in ourselves and others. And yeah, something like that is why I think I'd go that particular way. But I do see the slight awkwardness of that for an agency incompatibilist, because it's like saying that your central philosophical thesis is actually shakeable, maybe too easily shakeable in the face of scientific discovery, and rather than just saying, so there wasn't any agency after all. Yes, yeah.
Right, thanks.
Okay, so I'll ask a quick question. So you take the settledness and the agency and all that stuff just at face value, and you're just going to assume that, and then you've got this argument where in some ways you know that you have agency, and the fact that you know that gives you reason to conclude that determinism's false, although you're open to the possibility that it could be shown that it were true, right? And I just wonder whether, than looking at it as the Stanford scenario, indeed what you have instead are Stanford scenarios. And here are all sorts of scientific skepticisms. Now the debate in quantum physics about whether superdeterminism is true, or debates in cosmology about whether the block universe is the right model or the multiverse, or debates in psychology about situationism and dispositions and the influence of situational factors that drive our behaviors without our conscious awareness, or the debate about automaticity, or debates that you already referenced about epiphenomenalism or aluminum materialism, or whether behavioral genetics and gene-environment interactions explain a sufficient amount of our behavior to make us unfree, or computational neuroscience suggesting that decision-making doesn't fit the full psychological model. I mean, here are all these empirical questions, and it looks like the move that we're making with determinism just gives me the ability to say that in some sense, I already know the answer to these empirical questions. I could be convinced somehow if there was a scientific consensus in each case that it were true. But to me, it seems like each of those, maybe not epiphenomenalism, but each of those might be true on a nearer by world than determinism, right? And so I just wonder whether this same move somehow proves too much, that now I can know not just determinism, which you might think, how could we ever know, but some of these maybe more obvious things like Chandra's recent talk on computational neuroscience and that stuff, which suggests that maybe like decision-making doesn't fit our full psychological model. And somehow this stuff is, I wonder like whether you're just going to make the same move. I get that. That's the question, whether the same move is going to work in all of these maybe Stanford scenario-like situations. I don't know if that makes sense.
I mean, I'd be open to some of those things turning out to be right, you know. I mean, my one thing to say, which I haven't mentioned, in fact, in this talk, but I talk about it a lot in the book, in Metaphysics for Freedom, is that I absolutely don't deny that lots of things are determined, can be determined. They are. My point is just that each action is such that something is settled by its occurrence. It doesn't have to be, you know, everything about the action. Some of the features of the action may well have been settled in advance. And I think I'd want to say the same sort of thing about the kinds of case you imagine. I think that, you know, some of those are going to turn out to be right. There are going to be these things that are sort of in conflict with our common a garden everyday sense of what it is we have power over and what we're like as agents. Of course we're wrong about lots of that. We already know we are. But my point would be that, universal determinism makes us wrong about everything. Everything that matters, everything important has gone if universal determinism is true. But islands of, bits and pieces of determination that we didn't know were there, I am okay with those, and I think they're there. It's the totally global universal determinism. It's the idea that is really conceivable and consistent with our agency that's problematic for me.
Well, thank you again. Seriously, I know you're on a different time zone here, so it's been great. So I appreciate it. Justin, you're up.
Hi, Helen. Can you hear me?
Hi, Justin. I can. Yes.
This is just sort of a friendly question. When you were talking about the first plank and thinking about compatibilism as kind of a safe harbor against these empirical sort of refutations, I was wondering what you thought about this move. You didn't mention it, so I was just wondering if maybe you didn't like it or if you didn't think about it, and then what you did think about it. It looks like a lot of theses that compatibilists would accept, for instance, a causalist theory of action, they have empirical implications too, right? So causalism about action entails that our behavior is going to be caused in an appropriate way by certain mental states or by their neural realizers, right? Depending on your version. It entails that we're not being covertly and directly manipulated by Martians, from a faraway planet. And these are all things that could be empirically confirmed or disconfirmed. So in this respect, they're not different from libertarianism or agent incompatibilism. So then I guess the question would be, what's so bad about libertarianism or agency incompatibilism? I mean, why does the fact that it has empirically disconfirmable implications, why is that bad for it, but not bad for these causalist theories of action or these compatibilist theories of free will? Both types of views have implications that can be empirically confirmable or disconfirmable. So if this isn't a problem for libertarians or agency incompatibilists, if it isn't a problem for the causalist or for the compatibilist, why should it be a problem for the libertarian or the agency incompatibilist?
That's a really interesting question, which I've never thought about before. I mean, I suppose the reason why I have been bothered by the worry so far as agency incompatibilism is concerned is because people are, I get asked this question all the time. If you're right, we ought to be able to prove that determinism's false. And that can't be right, can it? That's a very, very common response I've found. So I suppose, that's biographically the reason why I focused on it. Of course, it's true that, yes, in detail, it would be true too that different versions of compatibilism have empirically confirmable or disconfirmable consequences. But I suppose they'd be, I'd envisage them being, more specific and more defensible against with small shifts, if you see what I mean, in the nature of the compatibilist claims. Whereas with agency incompatibilism, it would have to be, it has to be the giant shift in order to defend again the giant shift back into the arms of the compatibilist to defend against the worries. If they were legitimate worries, which of course I don't think they are, but yeah. So something like that, but I must admit it's never occurred to me before that the problem is
I guess I guess
found.
the reason why I rather like that point is because I always took the sort of problem that people, direct at you, and I feel like they direct it at libertarians too, even if they're not agency incompatibilists. The thought is we can't prove these empirical claims using a philosophical argument.
Mm.
But it looks like compatibilism and causalism can prove certain empirical claims with a philosophical argument. You just combine the philosophical claims and note their empirical implications, and then you say, aha, I have a philosophical argument that, my mental states or brain states, certain brain states cause my behavior. And so if that's not problematic there,
Yeah.
it can't be, the problem can't just be that they're empirically confirmable or disconfirmable. It has to be something else.
No, that's right. That's right. I do have a look in the paper that I mentioned in the Aristotelian Society. I do look at those arguments. People were very worried at one point. I don't know if people remember this, that by knowing the contents of our own thoughts, where those were externalist contents, we'd be able to show that, water existed and things like that. And there was a lot of discussion about that knowledge. And if whether indeed we had it and how we could come to have it by merely knowing the contents of our own thoughts in combination with certain externalist theses. And I did think a bit about that particular analogy, but I think you're revealing to me that it's a much broader issue in general than I've been supposing. And I think I need to think about, does feel to me a bit different, but I need to think about quite why it's different for the agency incompatibilist. Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, so fittingly, it looks like Pamela has the last question and she's the next speaker. So that's a perfect transition for us. So Pamela, please ask your question, and then we'll call it an evening in one place, an afternoon or a morning, depending on where everyone is.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this. It's been really helpful and clarifying and seeing your picture. And my question is really just about the last plank and the parallel with the external world skepticism. Yeah. Oh, I did the thing I wasn't supposed to do and lowered my hand. Sorry.
No, it's fine. You're fine.
Okay. So I mean, one of the things about external world, the thing about external world skepticism, at least originally with the evil demon, is that you're in principle cut off from any evidence that would disprove it, right? That the empirical evidence is in principle unavailable to you. So you could come out to learn, that we're all brains in a vat or whatever, but no amount of scientific study within the matrix is going to get that for you. Yeah. And so, unless for Kant, you could go transcendental idealists, or, there's ways you can try to get out of that. But so that seems like a big disanalogy with what you're conceding about determinism, because what you're conceding, so to say, I already know that there's an external world, but it's conceivable that we could learn that we're all brains in a vat. You can get that if you fiddle with the idea of knowledge, so that we don't have to know that we know, or so that, these in principle possibilities aren't really important. But what you're wanting to say is that I already know that I'm an agent. Agency is incompatible with a particular scientific possibility, and that scientific possibility might turn out to be true, right? So it's, we can't fiddle with the word no in the same way that fiddling with it in a way that would allow us to get the external world case won't be sufficient fiddling to get it in the determinism case, because we're saying that there's an empirically available path, to this knowledge, and yet we still can say now that we know that we're agents. So that it's just a disanalogy that I'm not sure how you want to address, and maybe you've thought
really
about it in your other work. And I'll add two follow-up points. One is there's a current conversation in epistemology with Jane Friedman. She argues that there's a norm. I disagree with her about this, but she argues that there's a norm: don't believe and inquire. And if you were to accept that norm, then you would be in the position of saying that the scientists who are pursuing this question are irrational, according by her
what
light.
the norm is: don't believe and inquire.
Don't believe and inquire. Don't both believe something is true and inquire whether
and
it's true.
inquiring to it. I see. I got it.
And then the second point, just an observation. So a couple of times you were wanting to say, if determinism were shown to be true, I wouldn't be myself, which is a beautiful contradiction, right? And sort of in the context of external world skepticism, sort of beautifully connected to what Descartes thought was going to save him, which is, I think. So anyway, I just float that out as some enticement. But so do you have a thought about the role of the empirical world in the two kinds of skepticism? Oh, sorry, the role of empirical knowledge, I should say.
I mean, one thing is what's meant by empirical knowledge. That strikes me as quite important, because what I'm imagining these scientists are going to give me, if they're going to carry conviction, won't be bits and pieces of this experiment or that experiment. It will be, as it were, a massive worldview of a sort that makes sense of a big range of empirical phenomena, probably from different sciences, that connects together physics with other sciences. That might be part of the argument for thinking that the new theory is true. I mean, it won't be little little bits of experimentation, if you see what I mean. It'll be a giant theory, and in a way, it will therefore be a bit more like a philosophical theory. It will be it will be a big worldview. Obviously, in order to be science, it's got to be connected in some way with observable phenomena and so on. But I'm imagining that the sort of science that could prove that determinism was true would be very, very far-reaching and all-encompassing, because, I mean, one of the things that has always troubled me about the attempt to mount a defense of determinism on the idea that it's a thesis for physicists is it just begs all sorts of questions about what the relationships are between, the levels of reality. About why haven't the biologists got anything to say about whether determinism is true, or the psychologists? Why shouldn't they be involved in the overall quest to decide whether determinism is true? Surely everybody's got skin in that game, not just physicists. But I suppose there could be, I don't know, some kind of, I don't even know how to imagine it, because it's we don't have such a scenario remotely imminent, and of course, in my view, we'll never have one, very likely. But one can imagine scientists saying, look, there's this thing we found out about time and space, and the only thing that makes sense of it is determinism, or something like that is what I'm envisaging. It's it would have to be giant and huge. In that way, it would be a bit like kind of getting outside, getting outside the you know, the computer that your brain in the vat is connected to, and seeing the world from elsewhere. I mean, that's, yeah. That, I think, yeah, I don't know. That hasn't really answered your question, has it, Pamela? Yeah. I feel like there's more to say to defend the analogy than I can come up with at the moment. But yeah, it's a good question. And yeah, I'll have to think about it some more.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting.
Well, thank you for the question, Helen. Thank you for being such a good sport. I know it's later on your side of the pond, so I'm very much appreciative of your time. I enjoyed the talk. Hopefully I'll see everybody at Pamela's talk here in just a few months. If you got any questions, stick around. I'll usually be here for a couple seconds. Otherwise, thanks for showing up to everybody else. It's been a great event, so thanks.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you so much, Thomas, for putting it on. I really enjoyed myself, and thanks everyone for comments and questions there. It was really great and lovely to put faces to names as well, because of course, you know, I've read many of you and never actually seen you, even on a screen, let alone in the flesh. So so that's been very nice.
It's always my honor. So thanks again.
Thanks very much.
Sure.
Bye-bye.
Thanks everybody. Bye.